He tore off her gladiator armor. Mid-battle, she let him continue. The thunder of the Veyron arena was a living wave. Thousands of voices fused into a single demand for carnage. Mason, all battered sinew and scarred resolve, crouched behind his dented shield as a six-eyed Gorvax swung its spiked mace. The impact sent a shudder through his bones, sparks flaring at the rim of his shield as the weight of the blow nearly drove him to one knee. Sand, already darkened by the blood of countless victims, ground beneath his boots as he forced himself upright, muscles screaming with fatigue and determination. Above him, the Gorvax loomed, a towering hulk of chitin and muscle, breath steaming between tusks. To Mason's right, Celira was a streak of blue light. She moved with inhuman poise, slipping under the arc of the Gorvax's weapon. Her energy blade sang, a pure, high note, as it flashed through the beast's lower limbs. Slices of armored flesh dropped to the sand, thick black ichor splattering Celira's gleaming armor. She was elegance and calculation incarnate, every gesture a study in control. Mason grunted, barely dodging a wild backhand swing from the Gorvax. "Celira, little help!" he shouted. She did not answer, but her mask's eyes flickered, an unspoken signal. Mason didn't hesitate. He surged forward, planting his feet and ramming his shoulder into the Gorvax's torso. The beast staggered, balance lost. Mason's short sword found the tiny gap beneath its chin, punching through cartilage with a wet crunch. The Gorvax convulsed, then collapsed. The arena's crowd erupted. The sound was a physical thing, pounding Mason's chest, electric in its violence. Mason sucked in a shaky breath, chest heaving, as he wiped black gore from his blade. He turned to Celira, whose mask tilted in silent appraisal. "Nice timing," he muttered, voice thick with adrenaline. She sheathed her blade, standing impossibly straight despite the carnage. "Your ferocity was effective, crude, but effective." Before Mason could retort, guards in black exo-armor closed in, stun batons raised. They prodded Mason and Celira through a rusted door, down stone corridors rank with sweat and iron. The clang of the arena faded, replaced by the mechanical whirring of surveillance drones and the distant, hopeless screams of other prisoners. Their cell was a cube of cold, pitted metal, barely wide enough for the two of them to pace. Mason yanked off his scorched gauntlets, tossing them onto the cot. "Next time you play decoy, a little warning would be nice," he snapped, stripping off his battered breastplate and flexing aching arms. Celira, ever composed, removed her helmet and set it aside with meticulous care. Her skin, luminescent, alive with shifting quantum patterns, caught the cell's sickly light, refracting it into colors Mason could hardly name. Her golden, slit-pupilled eyes regarded him coolly. Blue-white fur traced the edges of her pointed ears, each swiveling independently to track the guard's retreat. "My tactics were optimal," she replied, her voice soft but edged with frost. "Had you been more attentive, you would have recognized the distraction." He scowled, running a hand through sweat-matted hair. "Attentive. I was too busy keeping that thing from turning me into paste." Brute force invites risk, precision mitigates it. Their arguments had settled into a rhythm over the weeks. Celira, the exiled Valian aristocrat, all precision and icy logic. Mason, the battered human survivor, thriving on instinct and raw will. Yet, together, they were undefeated. A spectacle the arena's master never failed to exploit. Their survival, once unthinkable, had become routine. But routine did nothing to dull the ever-present threat of death. Mason sat heavily on the cot. "How many fights left, you think?" Before Celira could reply, the corridor outside shuddered with the screech of metal. The cell door yawned open, and the announcer's voice slithered through, a voice as smug as oil. "Champions, The warden is impressed. Time for your final ordeal. Freedom is within reach. Mason's breath caught. He met Celira's gaze, the chill in her eyes melting to a brief, raw intensity. In that heartbeat, rivalry vanished, replaced by the silent promise of survival. Together. They were escorted through a labyrinth of tunnels, the crowd's roar swelling with every step. When they emerged into the arena, the sun struck them like a hammer. Mason blinked, vision swimming as the stands rose in a living, writhing mass, every spectator hungry for spectacle. Their opponents awaited, the Scarn brothers, tall, insectoid killers, their bladed arms twitching, bodies bristling with hydraulic talons. Their chitinous armor gleamed obsidian in the sun, mandibles flexing in anticipation. A gong shattered the tense silence. The Scarns attacked at once, moving with unnatural synchrony. Mason's shield intercepted the first, blades shrieking against battered metal. The second Scarn vaulted, landing behind Celira, claws lashing out. Mason shouted, "Celira, now!" They moved as one. Mason advanced, feinting left, drawing both Scarns' attention. Celira darted to the side, her blade a blue flash, carving a deep gash in a Scarn's armored side. Black fluid hissed onto the sand, but the twins adapted, circling back to back. The crowd howled as the Scarns pressed Mason and Celira toward the electrified barricades, forcing them to split. Suddenly, one Scarn reared up, aiming its jagged mandibles at Celira. With a guttural screech, it spat a jet of caustic black fluid. The corrosive spray struck Celira's chest plate. Instantly, her advanced armor began to twist and fuse, the material warping into a grotesque shell that locked her limbs in place. Pain seared through her. Celira's mask warped, quantum circuitry sparking. She gasped, falling to one knee as the suit constricted, the acid eating through layer after layer. Her cool composure fractured, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The wounded Scarn lunged, blades spinning, closing in as Celira's movement slowed to a crawl. She looked up, locking eyes with Mason across the sand, her golden gaze naked with fear. She was about to die, trapped and burning inside her own armor. As the Scarn's blade descended, Mason didn't hesitate. He hurled himself into Celira, slamming his shoulder into her side and spinning her away from the lethal arc. The world shrank to the split-second collision of bodies and the shriek of rending metal. Celira's breath came in ragged gasps, her armor blazing hot against Mason's chest as he shielded her from the killing strike. The Scarn's blade bit into Mason's own shoulder, pain exploding down his arm as metal parted flesh. "Get it off!" Mason barked, teeth clenched, his own agony distant compared to the panic rising in Celira's golden eyes. "It's fused, you idiot!" she gasped, voice raw and cracking. Her limbs jerked, half-trapped by the warped, melting chest plate. Every movement brought a hiss of pain. Above them, the Scarn twins circled, one wounded but relentless, the other's mandibles twitching with anticipation, the scent of victory in the air. There was no time for finesse. Mason's only choice was brutal. He seized the glowing edge of Celira's armor, ignoring the searing heat that blistered his fingers. The smell of scorched skin and smoldering polymer filled his lungs. With a desperate roar, he dug his fingers beneath the fused plate, bracing his boots in the blood-streaked sand. The metal shrieked in protest as he pulled, tearing through synthetic fibers and seared flesh alike. Celira's scream ripped through the arena, piercing the crowd's bloodlust and leaving a hush in its wake. Her back arched as Mason wrenched the armor away, exposing her torso, raw, burned, and trembling. For a heartbeat, her luminous skin flickered, quantum patterns shattering in agony. Mason wrapped himself around her, sheltering her body with his own as the Scarns closed in for the kill. But something had shifted in the chaos. The victory bell rang out, clear and final. Mason blinked, chest heaving, as he realized the Skarn brothers now lay sprawled and twitching in the sand, defeated by wounds and the relentless pace of the fight. The crowd's silence was a new kind of violence, heavy with expectation, every pair of eyes locked on the battered pair at the center of the arena. Guards swarmed in, clad in black exo-armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored masks. They seized Mason and Celira, dragging them upright. Mason nearly buckled, but refused to release Celira, his arm a shield around her shoulders. Together, they were hauled back through the stone corridors, past flickering holoscreens and walls that still echoed with the arena's lingering roar. Inside the cell, Celira collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with aftershocks of pain. Mason dropped to his knees beside her, stripping off his blistered gloves, his own wounds forgotten. Blood oozed from his shoulder, but he barely registered it as he fumbled with the battered medkit, hands shaking. "Don't touch me," Celira whispered, her voice barely audible, but he ignored her. He pulled open the kit, retrieving the sterile burn spray, the biofoam. His movements were surprisingly gentle, at odds with his battered frame. "I need to clean this," he said, voice softer. He sprayed the numbing mist across her ruined skin, watching her jaw tighten against a fresh wave of pain. She tried to turn away, but his hand steadied her, careful, patient. "You never listen," she murmured through gritted teeth, but the edge in her voice was gone, replaced by exhaustion. "Not when you're bleeding," Mason replied. "Hold still." As he worked, Mason's fingers brushed against something hard, embedded in the shredded remains of her armor. Frowning, he pried it loose, a shard of dark metal, bristling with microfilaments and coded etchings. He turned it over in his palm, recognition flickering in his eyes. "This isn't Skarn tech," he said, voice low. He held the device up for Celira to see, a military-grade microcatalyst, its signature unmistakable. "This is Valian. Your people's tech." Celira's eyes widened, her breath catching. She stared at the device, realization and horror warring across her bruised features. The warden hadn't just wanted blood. He had orchestrated her torment with the tools of her own people. A test, a spectacle, a message. A single tear welled in Celira's eye, tracing a glowing path down her cheek. The composure she'd worn like armor fractured, her mask of indifference falling away. She looked suddenly impossibly young, exiled royalty stripped of defenses, laid bare beneath the arena's cruelty. Mason watched her for a moment, then reached out and brushed the tear away, his touch clumsy but careful. He didn't speak. Words felt useless, brittle things in the face of her grief. Celira's eyes met his, searching, vulnerable. For the first time, she looked at him, not as a partner, not as a rival, but as the man who'd thrown himself into death's teeth to save her. The world outside the cell faded, replaced by the fierce, fragile connection between them. Mason's hand lingered on her face, rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The air between them pulsed with things unsaid: fear, gratitude, longing, the raw ache of survival. Celira caught his hand in hers, trembling but determined. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then leaned in, closing the distance. His lips met hers, at first hesitant, almost questioning, then deepening as Celira pressed into him, her pain and need igniting something fierce and bright between them. Mason gathered her close, mindful of her burns, their kiss a collision of desperation and hope. For a moment the world's brutality receded, replaced by the electric intimacy of skin against skin, breath mingling, hearts pounding in tandem. They found solace in each other, awkward, imperfect, urgent. Celira's hands trembled as she traced the line of Mason's jaw, her golden eyes shining with tears and defiance. Mason cradled her, his rough fingers gentle on her luminous skin, both of them clinging to the fragile piece they'd carved from violence. Afterward, the silence felt different, no longer oppressive, but sheltering. Mason sat on the edge of the cot, watching Celira sleep. Her features, so often hardened by calculation, were softened now by exhaustion and vulnerability. Her chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, her quantum patterns flickering faintly beneath the damaged skin. He brushed a strand of silver-blue hair from her brow, a quiet ache blooming in his chest. Survival was no longer enough. He wanted more, for her, for both of them. Freedom, not just from the arena, but from the past that had brought them here. As the darkness outside their cell deepened, Celira stirred, eyes fluttering open. She sat up, her movements slow but sure, resolve settling over her like new armor. "He won't let us live," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. That was the crescendo. He'll want a new tragedy now. Mason met her gaze, a smile ghosting across his bruised lips. "Then we write our own story." He squeezed her hand, the promise hanging between them, fragile but unbreakable. Together, they would seize the narrative, no longer victims, but the authors of their own fate. Celira revealed her armor's neural link could access the arena's systems with a guard's comm bracelet. She traced the lines of circuitry on the ruined breastplate, eyes flickering with the old, calculating fire as she explained. "The neural mesh was damaged, but if I can connect it to a comm bracelet, I can override doors, surveillance, maybe even the collars." Mason's lips quirked. "You could have mentioned that before." She shot him a dry look, golden pupils narrowing. "I needed the right interface. And trust." He crouched beside her in the dimness, voice low. "The maintenance ducts run beneath our cell. I saw the grates during the last cleaning rotation. There are passages connecting half the underbelly. If we time it during the chaos, we could reach the exterior walls before the warden notices." For the first time since they met, Celira's eyes glimmered with genuine admiration. "Clever. You're more than a blunt instrument, Mason." "Don't let it get out," he said, flashing a lopsided grin. He reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "But we'll need more than just the two of us. We need Brack." Brack, the four-armed colossus in the next cell, was respected by nearly every fighter. Mason had watched him for weeks, how the younger gladiators looked to him, how the guards gave him a wide berth. If anyone could rally the others, it was Brack. Their plan began with a delicate dance of signals passed during trial matches and ration lines. Mason caught Brack's eye through the slotted window, giving a quick, precise nod. The next day, he faked a stumble near Brack's cage, whispering, "Purge night, together, wedge formation. You lead the left, I'll take the right." Brack's four-fingered hand clasped Mason's forearm through the bars. "You have courage, little human. My arms are yours, when the moment comes." Celira worked in parallel, but alone. After a staged outburst, the guards tossed her into solitary, an opportunity more than a punishment. There, under the dissonant hum of strip lights, she waited until a guard grew careless. When he bent to check her restraints, she slipped the comm bracelet from his wrist with a flick of her slender fingers. Back in her cell, she linked the comm bracelet to her armor's neural mesh, her senses plunging into the digital bloodstream of the arena. She drifted through security feeds, mapping patrols, tracing the web of explosive collars. A flaw appeared, a synchronization lag in the override signals. If she could trigger a pulse at the right moment, she could disrupt the network long enough for the collars to fail. While Celira hacked and Mason plotted, the warden, Drace, watched from his glass-walled sanctum. He separated Mason and Celira, subjecting each to psychological games. Drace's voice slithered through intercoms, probing for weakness. "Tell me, Mason, if Celira falls, do you fight on or do you surrender?" And Celera, do you trust your human? Or is he just another blade pointed at your back? Neither broke. If anything, the tests hardened their resolve, the shared threat binding them tighter. Drace, delighting in the drama, announced a new, immersive match. Mason and Celira were shoved into a flooded, pitch-black chamber, forced to enter from opposite ends, uncertain if they would even find each other before the other pairs cut them down. The water was icy, swirling with oil and debris. Celira's armor was stripped of sensors. She was blind, every step treacherous. "Can you hear me?" Mason's voice echoed softly in the dark. She stilled, straining. "Yes. Your voice is my anchor." Other pairs thrashed and fought in the darkness. Celira pressed forward, blade raised, heart pounding. Mason's voice guided her, each word a lifeline. 2 steps left. Duck! A blade hissed past her ear. She pivoted, slashing low, feeling the resistance of flesh, the spray of water. Mason was suddenly there, his hand on her shoulder. Steady, sure. They moved as one, her blade an extension of his will, his bulk her shield in the chaos. In the shadows, their touches lingered longer than necessary, a hand to her hip to guide her, her palm steady on his back as he cleared a path. Every contact a spark, every breath drawn in tandem, a reminder of what they'd become. They fought together until silence fell, emerging victorious, united and soaked, illuminated by the flicker of overhead lights as the chamber drained. Drace's glee echoed over the arena's speakers. "Magnificent! A pair forged in darkness. My audience will love this. The Grand Reckoning approaches, champions. Be ready." The Grand Reckoning, Purge Night, 50 fighters, 1 arena, only a handful would survive. But Mason and Celira had chosen this night for revolt. In the holding cells, Mason moved from group to group, always under the watchful eye of guards. He spoke in code, "Hold the line. Follow Brack. No one breaks." Allies nodded, a silent pact of battered hands and steely eyes. Brake towered at the center, his presence a mountain none dared challenge. Meanwhile, Celira was summoned to Drace's tower. She passed through gilded corridors, the walls pulsing with the hum of surveillance. In Drace's private lounge, he lounged among holograms and velvet, his gaze a predator's. "You intrigue me, Celira. Valian grace, human cunning. What would you do for freedom?" She smiled, cold and dazzling. "Anything." While he preened, she slipped her scavenged device, a compact pulse emitter, into the comm port beneath his desk. Her fingers worked quickly, her neural mesh guiding her. When the time came, the device would send a disruptive pulse through the control network. Back in the arena, the gates opened onto a blood-soaked field. The guards jeered, rifles ready. The crowd howled from the stands, oblivious to the undercurrent of rebellion. Mason found Brack, their eyes meeting across the sand. Mason raised his fist. "For liberty," he whispered. Brack's forearms lifted, echoing the call. "For liberty!" The gladiators formed a wedge, disciplined, silent, deadly. At the vanguard, Brack led the charge, his massive frame absorbing the first hail of stun rounds. Mason darted alongside, shield raised, shouting orders. The wedge punched through the first rank of guards, scattering them like chaff. The other fighters followed. Humans, saurians, even an old enemy or two, united by desperation and hope. Celira watched from Drace's tower, eyes locked on Mason, her pulse synced to the chaos below. As the melee erupted, Celira activated her pulse device. Alarms blared, control panels fizzled and died, explosive collars sparking harmlessly. Doors around the arena snapped open, fighters poured into the corridors, overwhelming the surprised guards. Mason's voice cut through the chaos. "For liberty!" The words surged from his throat, echoed by every fighter as the wedge stormed the gates. The uprising had begun. From the tower, Celira triggered her device. The pulse rippled invisibly through the arena's systems. Across the killing sands, the explosive collars around the gladiators' throats sparked, sizzled, and tumbled free. For one suspended instant, all was still. The crowd's jeers frozen, the fighters staring in disbelief. Then, as if the world had taken a breath and screamed, a roar of triumph swept the stadium. Chains hit the dirt, and the riot became a battle for freedom. Below, chaos reigned. Mason and his wedge of fighters surged across the arena, hurling guards from the parapets, using every trap and pit the warden had ever turned against them. Spiked barricades flipped, tripwires launched nets over squads of security. A gladiator Mason barely knew laughed as he triggered a flame jet on a squad of guards, the tide shifting with every clever reversal. Mason's shield was battered, his arms slick with blood and sweat, but his purpose had never been clearer. Each step brought him closer to the tower and to Celira. Above, in the warden's glass-walled sanctum, Drace spun as alarms blared and feed screens flickered to static. His eyes landed on Celira, framed in the blue glow of her device, and his face contorted with hatred. He snatched a jeweled plasma pistol from beneath his desk, training it on her. "You should have stayed broken. Alien." He sneered, finger tensing on the trigger. Celira turned to face him, her silhouette reflected 100-fold in the shattered monitors. She drew her blade, voice glacial and unshaken. "I was never broken. Only tempered." Drace fired, but she was already moving, a blur of quantum-lit grace, blade arcing to deflect the bolt. Glass exploded behind her as she rolled aside, coming up low and fast. Drace kept firing, wild now, bolts scorching through velvet and steel. Celira advanced, every movement precise, her blade a silver comet as she closed the distance. Below, Mason's fighters pressed forward, routing the last defenders from the gates. Brake thundered beside Mason, tossing aside a pair of guards with his lower arms. "Get to your mate, human!" he bellowed, grinning fiercely. Mason nodded, pushing on through the fray, boots pounding up the spiral staircase to the tower. Inside, Celira and Drace circled each other, the pistol versus the blade. Drace's arrogance twisted into panic as Celira closed in, her eyes burning gold. She feinted left, then darted right, her blade flickering through the air in a flurry of cuts. Drace yelped, the pistol spinning away as she knocked it from his grasp. Desperate, Drace lunged, striking Celira across the jaw with a jeweled fist. She staggered, vision swimming, the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Drace raised his arm for another blow, but the door burst open, and Mason crashed in like a living battering ram. He tackled Drace to the floor, fists slamming into the warden's chest and jaw. Drace fought back, clawing and kicking, but Mason's rage was a force beyond fear or fatigue. The two men rolled, shattering furniture, bruises blooming with every blow. Drace snatched up a metal shard, slashing at Mason's side, but Mason caught his wrist and twisted, snapping bone. "Go!" Mason shouted to Celira, never looking away from his foe. "Get to the hangar. I'll finish this." For a split second, Celira hesitated, eyes meeting Mason's. So much said in that glance, trust and promise. Then she turned and sprinted from the room, her bootsteps echoing down the corridor. Mason and Drace brawled, neither holding anything back. Drace fought like a cornered animal, but Mason's determination was steel. With a guttural roar, Mason drove his knee into Drace's thigh, then landed a savage elbow to the warden's jaw. Drace crumpled, gasping, but Mason hauled him up and delivered a brutal blow to the leg. Bone cracked, Drace shrieked, collapsing in agony. Mason let him fall. "That's for every life you stole," he said, voice hoarse. Then he turned, racing after Celira. In the corridors, the freed gladiators surged toward the spaceport, the last of the guards in full retreat. Sirens wailed, flames licking at the edges of the stands. Celira reached the hangar, Drace's personal shuttle gleaming on its launch pad. She ran up the ramp, blade drawn, facing the handful of guards left to make a final stand. Mason limped in, shield up, blood streaking his arm. "Room for another?" he called, voice rough but alive. Celira grinned, fierce and wild. "Always!" They stood back to back as the last guards attacked, Celira's blade and Mason's shield moving in perfect concert. Blaster fire ricocheted. A guard screamed as Celira's blade found his side. Mason's fist caved in another's helmet. Together they held the ramp, covering each other as the surviving fighters streamed for freedom. Brack bellowed a salute from below, 4 arms raised in triumph. "Go, little humans!" Brack roared, voice ringing with pride. Mason hit the ramp controls and the shuttle's doors sealed shut. Celira sprinted to the pilot's seat, hands flying across unfamiliar controls, every instinct on edge. Engines screamed, the ship bucking as she fought to disengage the lockdown. Mason dropped into the co-pilot's chair, glancing at her, breathless. "You sure you can fly this thing?" Celira shot him a sidelong look, a half-smile curling her lips. "Watch me." Alarms howled as the shuttle lifted, fire and smoke swirling outside the viewport. Celira guided them up and out, the craft juddering as blaster fire stitched the hull. She pulled the throttle, engines roaring as they punched through the upper atmosphere. The burning arena and the broken chains of their past shrank away, replaced by the limitless violet sky of Veyron. In orbit, Celira set the course away from the planet, the stars wheeling around them. The view cast shifting patterns across her profile, gold, blue, and silver dancing on her skin. Mason knelt beside her, gently dabbing a cut on her cheek with a med patch. She reached for his bruised arm, her touch soft and steady. They were fugitives, wounded and hunted, with only each other. Yet, as Mason's hand lingered on her face and Celira's eyes shone with fierce hope, it felt like everything. Later, in the med bay, Celira faced her reflection in a polished steel panel. She traced new scars along her collarbone, the pain and pride mingling in her eyes. Mason entered, his presence solid and warm behind her, his arms still trembling from battle. He stepped close, his fingers brushing one of her scars. "My people call this surviving," he said quietly, voice rough with emotion. Celira closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "They'll come for us," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Let them. I'm done running." His reply was a vow, binding them to whatever future they could seize, together. Celira's mind raced, calculating probabilities and dangers in the silence after the jump. She leaned over the navigational console, fingers dancing across unfamiliar glyphs as Mason patched the co-pilot seat's torn fabric with steady hands. "This ship's signature is unique," Celira said, eyes never leaving the holomap. "We need a shadow port, supplies, credits, a destination. Somewhere we can disappear." Mason nodded, his voice low and certain. "First, we heal. Then, we plan." He glanced at her sidelong, concern and trust mingling in the set of his jaw. They limped to the med bay, moving with the awkwardness of exhaustion and adrenaline wearing off. The room glowed sterile and cold, but their presence filled it with quiet urgency. Mason peeled off his jacket, revealing the angry burns across his palm and forearm. Celira took his hand, her own fingers trembling only slightly. "Let me," she murmured. She cleaned the wound with a soft cloth, her touch infinitely careful. When she finished, she pressed her lips to his burned palm, closing her eyes, a gesture deeper than words, a benediction. Mason watched her, chest tight with gratitude and something older, wilder. Later, he sat her on the edge of the cot, cleaning the cuts along her ribs and collarbone. Each touch was a silent vow. I am here. I will not let go. Days passed, measured by the slow passage of stars and the hum of engines. The courier ship was sleek and fast, but even its speed could not outrun the memories stalking their sleep. They found uneasy peace in each other's company. Celira, brilliant and composed at the nav controls, was hilariously baffled by the sonic shower. Mason's laughter echoed down the corridor the first time she emerged, hair in wild blue tangles, grumbling about primitive human water rituals. He slept lightly, rising at every shudder of the hull. Sometimes he woke gasping, sweat slick on his brow, and found Celira's hand already in his, grounding him in the moment. One night, as the ship drifted through a field of sapphire nebulae, Mason cooked a meal from ration packs and stolen spice. He transformed bland protein slabs into something warm and comforting, the scent filling the galley. Celira sat across from him, watching the way he stirred the pot, the way his shoulders relaxed in the small domestic space. "You make this ship feel like home," she said softly. He looked up, startled by the vulnerability in her voice. "It's just soup," he replied, trying for levity. She shook her head, a smile ghosting across her lips. "No, it's more. No one has ever... It's been a long time since I remembered what kindness tasted like." The admission hung between them. Mason set his spoon aside, reaching for her hand. "Tell me something true," he said, voice gentle. Celira hesitated, then exhaled. "My last lover betrayed me, sold my name for a seat at the high table. I trusted him, and he offered me up for status. That's why I ended up at Veyron." Mason's grip tightened, his thumb brushing her wrist. "I lost my squad on Damaris. Ambush. I survived because I ran. Sometimes I think they would have hated me for it." She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You didn't run. You lived." That night, under the shifting glow of the nebula outside their window, they found each other again. Their lovemaking was slow and exploratory, a weaving together of wounds and hope. Celira traced Mason's scars with reverent fingers, while he murmured her name as if it were the only word that mattered. Pain receded, replaced by the building promise of something new. Days later, the rift appeared on the horizon, a shadow port carved into a shattered moon, notorious as a haven for outlaws and exiles. The docking bay was a cacophony of battered freighters, smugglers, and neon-lit stalls. As they disembarked, Celira adjusted the hood of her borrowed cloak, scanning the crowd. "We need new IDs and a secure data core, nothing traceable," she said, her voice crisp with purpose. Mason nodded. "I'll watch our backs." They moved through the market, Celira haggling with a grizzled Korvax vendor over forged credentials. Mason drifted by the cantina, alert for danger. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a bounty puck on the bar's holodisplay, their faces projected in ghostly blue light. The price on their heads was staggering. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Celira finished the deal, pocketing the new IDs. "Let's go," she whispered, urgency sharpening her tone. But before they could escape, a massive shadow blocked their path. Brake loomed over them, flanked by two bounty hunters, one a lithe saurian with a shock whip, the other a hulking cyborg with plasma knuckles. Brake's eyes glittered with regret and respect. "You are worth more than my freedom, little friends," he rumbled, his voice both apology and warning. Mason stepped in front of Celira, stance low and ready. "You don't have to do this, Brack. We bled together." The Saurian hunter flicked her whip, electricity crackling. "Move aside, hero. The price is too sweet." Celira's eyes hardened, her hand drifting to the hilt of her concealed blade. "You'll regret this," she promised. The fight exploded in a blur of violence. The Saurian's whip snapped toward Celira, but she darted aside, blade flashing in a silver arc that sliced the weapon in two. Mason ducked the cyborg's first blow, driving his knee into the attacker's groin and smashing an elbow into the exposed wiring at his neck. Brake hesitated, sorrow on his face, then swung one massive fist at Mason. Mason rolled with the impact, pain flaring, but he came up with his own blade, pressing the attack. Celira and the Saurian clashed, the two moving with deadly speed. Celira's style a dance of precision, the Saurian all coiled aggression. Mason feinted left, drawing Brack off balance. "We can both walk away," he shouted. Brack's eyes filled with a strange hope, but the cyborg lunged, swinging wildly. Mason ducked, grabbing a loose cable and yanking, the cyborg's arms sparking and falling limp. Mason pivoted and slammed his fist into Brack's gut, just enough to drop the gladiator to one knee. Celira finished her fight with a spinning kick, sending the Saurian crashing into a stall of glowing crystals. She spun, blood spattering her cheek, and grabbed Mason's hand. "Now!" she urged. Alarms blared across the port as Mason and Celira dashed through the chaos, ducking behind crates as guards and bounty hunters gave chase. Mason fired up the shuttle's ramp, Celira covering him with a stolen blaster. Brake, battered but alive, watched them go. A silent salute raised as the ship's engines roared. They launched into space, Rift shrinking to a smudge behind them. As the stars streaked past, Mason and Celira caught their breath in the cramped cockpit, bruised, bloodied, alive. Their fugitive journey was only beginning, but for now, together, it was enough. Back on the ship, adrenaline faded, leaving Celira hollowed out and trembling in the silence that followed their escape. The airlock hissed shut behind them, sealing the galaxy's chaos outside. She made her way to the cockpit on autopilot, blood still drying on her fingers, the echo of alarms and blaster fire a distant ghost in her ears. Mason moved behind her, quiet and watchful, but she hardly noticed. The star chart glowed in cool, shifting colors on the forward display, its constellation of known routes and blinking hazards a maze that now seemed endless. Celira stared at the tangled web of lines and systems, her breath coming slow and shallow. "This is our life now," she said finally, her voice soft but flat. Running, hiding, always hunted. Every port, every jump, another trap. Mason approached, footsteps measured and sure. He didn't try to answer at first. Instead, he stood beside her, letting the silence settle between them. A silence heavy with loss, longing, and all the things they had endured. Gently, he reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "No," he said, voice steady, not a denial, but a promise. "Prey runs. We choose our path." He lifted her hand, pressing it to his chest, where his heart beat strong beneath scarred skin. Then he leaned forward, tapping the console, zooming out on the chart until the crowded trade lanes and known territories shrank away. He pointed to a blank swath of stars, unmapped, raw space, all unknown. "What's out there?" Mason asked, searching her face. Celira's golden eyes flickered with old wariness. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing. Chaos. No one goes there. It's void. The nav beacons don't reach. There are stories. Ships disappear. Some say it's haunted." Mason's lips curved in a crooked smile, a glint of the old stubbornness lighting his eyes. "Perfect," he said. "We don't hide. We carve our own place. Something that's ours, not borrowed or stolen, not dictated by anyone else's rules." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on his. Fear flickered in her gaze, but beneath it was something new, an ember of hope where once there had only been survival. She let herself look at him, truly look, and saw not just the battered soldier or the partner in her escape, but the man who had chosen her again and again, even when the universe gave them every reason to break. "We'll have nothing out there," she murmured, her voice trembling. "No guarantees, no safety net, just us." Mason nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's more than I ever thought I'd have again. We build the rest, one day at a time." Celira drew a shaky breath. The control panel's cool light painted shifting patterns on her silver-blue skin. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the simple truth of his words, the invitation in them. When she opened her eyes, the fear was still there, but it was joined by determination. She rested her head on his shoulder, finding comfort in his solid warmth. "Set the course," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of wonder. Mason squeezed her hand, then moved to the nav controls. He tapped in new coordinates, each entry erasing old boundaries and opening a frontier. The console pinged, warning of uncharted hazards, but Mason only grinned wider. "We'll chart our own stars," he said, glancing at her. "Ready?" She nodded, her eyes bright with the beginnings of something fierce. "Ready." Together, they worked in easy rhythm, checking the ship's systems, prepping the engines for a jump into the great unknown. The hum of the drives filled the small cockpit, a heartbeat of anticipation. Celira leaned over the console, recalibrating the sensors for deep space drift, her hands steady now with purpose. Mason flipped switches and monitored power levels, every motion a silent promise of partnership, of trust, of a new beginning. They sat side by side as the jump timer counted down, the stars outside stretching into silver threads. Celira's hand found Mason's again, anchoring them both. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not anymore. Not with you." The words settled between them, simple and irrevocable. Celira looked at him, seeing hope where once she had seen only the next fight, the next betrayal. For the first time, she could imagine something beyond survival, a life not defined by running, but by what they would choose to build. The ship lurched as the jump engaged, the known galaxy falling away behind them. Mason glanced at Celira, a rare, boyish excitement lighting his eyes. She smiled back, the gesture small, but real. As the stars stretched before them, the past, the pain, the chains, the arena, became only one chapter in a story still unwritten. In that cockpit, surrounded by darkness and possibility, they were no longer captives of fate. They were partners, survivors, lovers, pioneers, ready to write the next chapter of their story, side by side. Our story ends here. Make sure you subscribe, press the like button, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most in this video. Your feedback means a lot to our team. You'll discover many more captivating stories on our channel. See you in the next one.